So welcome Tracie back.
Hey.
Hey. Woo. We got tons of suggestions for show stuff. There's people asking, hey, would you cover consciousness, and there's some questions about scientific method and things like that. So what are we actually going to talk about today?
Today I wanted to address a dialogue that I had that kind of clued me into how some people are viewing science. That initially when I had this dialogue, I made an assumption about the error that the person was making, and then later I saw someone else's evaluation of it, and I realized that I think they nailed it a little better. And it's one of those things where there's the idea that when a person if a person talks to me, they're giving me information about themselves. They're telling me what they think about something and how they view it. And so when I was looking at their response, I was taking it as sort of this is how I'm viewing what you're saying. But what they were actually doing was giving me a reflection of how they viewed how I was viewing it. And I was misinterpreting that as simply how they viewed it. It was just an interesting exchange, and I wanted to share it a little bit. The exchange itself happened on one of the forums, an atheist forum. And there was an article posted that included some content from me that dealt with evolution. And one of the responses that was given to the article was someone who wrote in and addressed it to me specifically and said that here's what Darwin had to say about me. And what they went on to give was a quote from Darwin that appears to be a quote that I would say promotes kind of a sexist view, using evolution as a reason for that. And when I read it, my response to the person was, is there some point to that? Are you unaware that people who lived in different eras have different ideas about, and it's too bad that my printout cuts out part of the margin, I didn't recognize that, but about humans. And even though the Bible explains, for example, how you ought to treat and manage your slaves, I think you likely think slavery is not a good thing, but that model of modern Christianity is certainly no stranger to anyone. Social views change, and beyond that, a person can hold to both correct and incorrect ideas at the same time. So what if Darwin even was as far gone as a raging pedophile? How would that invalidate whatever correct assumptions he might have made in the realm of biology? And I directed him to go look up the fallacy definition for ad hominem, because my assumption about what he posted was Darwin was a sexist, and therefore Tracie will not accept should question the evolutionary, the content of his statements about evolution.
He got this part wrong, so we should just dismiss the other bit.
Right, and beyond that, he chose specifically a statement about, that would be considered sexist and directed it to a woman. So in my mind, I looked at that from my personal perspective as, if Tracie sees Darwin as sexist, she will reject what Darwin had to say.
Yeah.
And my response was, I've never made a claim that, and I'm not trying to disparage anyone, I have no idea, but I've never claimed that Darwin is a good person, or that he's always right about everything, or, and to me, whether Darwin said it or someone else said it wouldn't have mattered. It's an observation. And
it kind of ties back to something we talked about before when like the question of the historicity of Jesus comes up, and people say, well, for example, Socrates may not have existed. He may have been a completely fictional invention of Plato to use as a mouthpiece.
Right.
And my point is, it doesn't matter to me whether Socrates existed or not. What matters is what he actually said.
Right.
His statements live or die on their own merits, and it doesn't matter whether Socrates said them or George W. Bush said them. If it's true, it's true. If it's not true, it's not true.
Correct. I mean, all that matters is that we have the character, whether the character is a human being or whether the character is a character in a book. If I were to quote Hamlet, am I quoting Hamlet or am I quoting Shakespeare? Well, I'm quoting the character Hamlet put forward by Shakespeare. Everything Hamlet says might not be everything Shakespeare agrees with.
Right.
So, it comes in the idea that even if he's a character, he speaks on his own. because the character, even though he might be authored by someone else,
Right,
doesn't
Plato,
necessarily express the view of the author, although in Plato's case it probably would.
No, well, not necessarily. Well, using Socrates, it probably does, or usually does.
Right.
But Plato would construct dialogues with a number of fictional speakers arguing all points of view. So clearly, what his characters
Right.
said didn't represent him. The reason, by the way, to sidetrack for half a second, the reason why it's a different case with the question of the historicity of Jesus is that what he says is intrinsically tied to who he is. If you say that you are a God, then your existence actually, comes
Right.
into question.
Well, in fact, I guess you could argue that what he said is actually less important than whether or not he existed.
Yeah.
Because if I were, for example, a fundamentalist Christian, it really wouldn't matter what Jesus had said. If I believed that he was God and that I should do what he says, then whatever he says is going to be what I should do.
Right.
So the words of Jesus become unimportant insofar, important to the Christian, maybe in directing their life, but not
Their truth value is not important.
Right.
They are asserted as truth because of the authority.
Right. The authority is who matters and not what he said.
And that'll actually tie into kind of what we're talking
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
By the way, Darwin was a racist and a sexist.
Okay.
No surprise there. So was almost everybody Darwin knew. The concepts of equality hadn't quite triggered in.
But to be honest, even if he was uniquely horrible in those aspects, it would in no way affect any observations that he made that did pan out to be verified.
Right.
If something is observable and someone says it, if Darwin says, the sun arises in the morning, that doesn't change just because he might not be a nice person.
Yeah.
And anything else he might say that is completely wrong and completely fallacious doesn't invalidate an observation that he might make that is correct.
Yeah.
So even though I hit on that by saying people can hold to opinions that are both correct and incorrect, I didn't really get to it as closely as one of the other posters who said, I presumed, and I believe I presumed fairly, that his worldview incorporates some form of authoritarianism embedded in church/religious leaders or icons. After all, it seems he presumed that scientists, many but not all, considered Darwin to the same degree of infallibility as Catholics do the Pope, or as Muslims do Mohammed, or as Mormons Joseph Smith, Scientologists Ron Hubbard, etc., etc. And what I began to realize is that when he posted the comment from Darwin, what he was actually doing was telling me how he viewed me. He wasn't telling me how he viewed the issue. And so my response to him as saying, you're making an ad hominem, was almost a response that said, you're trying to say that because he said one thing that was wrong, that anything he says that is right should be disregarded. But in reality, what he was trying to communicate was that he perceives that I perceive Darwin as authoritarian.
Right.
So I was kind of stunned by that, because that's when I started to see, he's not making a statement about how he views it. He's making a statement how he views that I view it. And in that regard, he's making a huge error in that he's considering that I consider it authoritarian. That the reason that I would accept any sort of evolutionary claim is because Darwin said it. And I will say to a larger degree, many Christians would say, because science says it.
Right.
And my response to that is, no. That's, like we were talking about this in one of the emails, that's just wrong. If Darwin says a thing and I can observe it, it's correct. I don't even know how to get around that. If it's observable and you can see it again and again and again, and you can test it, and you can go in and make predictions with it, and the thing holds up again and again and again, I don't know how to say that the thing doesn't stand on its own. Like you said, Socrates' words stand on their own.
Yeah.
Well, the reality of there's an evolutionary reality, right? There's a reality to evolution that is observable. And whether Darwin says it, or even if you outlawed anybody saying it, it doesn't make it go away.
Right.
So the thing itself stands, whether someone says it or not. And the reason that a person, and that brought up something else that I wanted to mention, which was that I get a lot of times, let's see, the statement that, people saying, well, science is looked at as a religion, or there are people who make science their religion. And there are people who adhere to science, with a very authoritarian attitude. And I've heard this claim repeatedly. And while I can't say that I have never seen a person sort of cave to a scientific claim simply because it was a scientific claim. I have seen that. But I can certainly say that the number of people who claim that people do that is hugely, vastly larger than the number of people I've actually ever seen do that. So there's this small segment of people who think that if science puts it forward, it's unquestionable truth, whether it's hypothesis or,
And oddly enough, those people aren't scientists, because one of the first things scientists realize is that there are no sacred topics. There are no unquestionable truths. The process of science is all about repeatedly questioning those truths to expand our knowledge. And there's nothing authoritarian. People don't accept evolution, and this drives me crazy because creationists seem to have some kind of, particularly the anti-evolution extreme creationists, folks like Ray Comfort or whatever, seem to have this idea that evolution is like some kind of global conspiracy, like Darwin popped up an idea and then some money changed hands under the table and we got it into the schools by, in order to indoctrinate, and you get these scientists to agree. The reason that scientists support evolutionary theory or acknowledge the fact of evolution has nothing to do with the fact that it came from Darwin or anybody else. As a matter of fact, the evolutionary model we use today is greatly different from anything that Darwin would have actually conceived. He caught his idea, his beautiful idea was natural selection, and that has applications outside of biology as well. But the evidence for the diversity of life through this process of natural selection is supported in all of the sciences that would be relevant to it. Whether it's geology. It could have been very much the case that when we discovered DNA, we could have discovered that this made the evolutionary theory impossible. Could have been the case that we discovered that within DNA there is something that prohibits this gradual change over time with natural selection. As a matter of fact, that's not the case. We discovered something completely new, and we find in it affirmation of the theory that we've been building, and it confirms that our understanding, while not complete, was at least correct. Correct in the broader scheme, and we continually fine-tune towards a better explanation.
Yeah, and one of the things that I mentioned in the article, and this is something else that I want to put forward, is evolution is an observable mechanism. I can't imagine what it would take for a person to dispute that you cannot change, what is it, the xenotype? What's the phenotype? Phenotype of an animal, that you can't change the physical characteristics of an animal by selecting the breeding. We know that can be done. We've done it. So it's doable. We know that there is a mechanism for changing the external physical features of this animal by selecting for specific genes. And
all the features of the animal, internal, external.
Yeah, when I say external, I mean it's just like we can see, we can observe.
Sure.
It is observable that you can change it. You can create a Great Dane or a Chihuahua within, using the same starting
And of course, the standard creationist response to that is, well, they're both dogs.
Okay, and the response to that, of course, is that we've seen evolution produce new species.
Yeah.
So evolution breaks that barrier. We've observed it break that barrier. And what happens is we have an observable mechanism, which is evolution, and we know that it can produce new species. We have never observed creationism, and creationism has never been observed to produce a new species. So when a person says to me, I think there are limits to what evolution can do, my response would be something like, maybe one day we will find a limit. But for now, there's not yet been a limit found. So what we have when a person says, I think that evolution can go this far but not this far, is a person who says, if you have a mechanism that creates a stalactite, you see that minerals are dripping down from water, it creates this stalactite. And we measure it and it grows, let's say, 1.5 inches per year based on that drip. And there's other stalactites around it that are 3 feet long. the person who's putting the limit down is basically saying, although we have a mechanism that we understand that produces a stalactite, we know that mineral deposits dripping from this water can produce, a growth in a stalactite. We've only measured stalactites for the last 100 years. Let's just say, I don't know how long that's been, but let's say we've started measuring them and how they grow for the last 100 years, and let's just say that we plug in that, the fastest growth we've ever seen is, a quarter inch a year. And so these 3-foot ones, I just don't think that same mechanism can account for those. I don't think that mineral deposit and dripping water made a 3-foot stalactite. That's the same assertion. I don't think it's a fair assertion. I don't think people would make that assertion about a stalactites, and I don't know why they assert it for evolution. But you have a mechanism that can do what you need it to do in order to explain what you're looking at, and you have another mechanism that has never been observed. No one knows anything about it. No one can reproduce it. Nobody can study it. Nobody can verify it, and they've never seen it work. And yet, it's put forward, and people wonder why people don't hold creationism and evolution on par.
Yeah. And interestingly, among the young Earth creationists, they actually challenge the mechanism for the creation of stalactites and stalagmites as well, because it would require more time than the Earth has actually existed. They're on this 6,000 to 10,000 year old Earth scheme.
Yeah.
So these stalactites and stalagmites that have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, kind of.
Right. And all that's doing is just taking evidence that's in your face and saying that I must refuse to accept this evidence because it conflicts with what I want to believe.
And I need to rework the data in order to match my preconceptions.
Yeah. And anyway, but the thing I'm looking at is I'm starting to, I think what I'm going to start doing is maybe pointing out that when someone says to me that people take science at face value as authoritarian, dictates of truth, I'm going to challenge them to show me someone doing that. Yeah. I'm not going to say that it never happens, but it certainly doesn't happen to the degree that it's dialogued about.
But even those people that do, even when they come up with examples, okay, those people are wrong. You don't.
Right.
I mean,
right, but that's not saying.
They may have the correct answer for the wrong reasons. That's entirely possible.
And that's part of my point, is that, does the number of people who make this error merit the amount of dialogue that it gets and the chastisement that is laid down for it? And I don't believe that it does.
Well, I think there's a significant chunk of the population that would just accept basically scientific pronouncements. But I think there's a completely different reason for this. As a matter of practicality, we could not individually go and investigate and come to a complete and accurate understanding of all the knowledge that humans have acquired. So we have to rely on authorities. If I talk to Mark, a physicist, and he gives me an explanation of something, I'm going to generally accept his explanation, especially if it's one that I don't understand, which happens quite a few times. I'm going to accept that he got it right. But the thing is that my acceptance of that is tentative. If some other physicist comes up and explains why Mark got it wrong, now I've got a conflict. And then I have to begin evaluating which of these experts is more reliable. And I can't just go with my gut and say, that one sounds better to me, because I'm not an expert in it at all. So the only solution at that point is to go out and investigate. And this is one of the reasons why we end up relying on consensus science. And as long as we're all doing this with the understanding that all scientific findings are tentative, that new evidence always leads us to reevaluate these things and possibly come up with new theories, new models that completely overturn old ones. Although I have to say that as we progress, the likelihood of overturning long-established scientific models begins to decrease dramatically. It's not like we are likely to find new evidence that our understanding of gravity is completely wrong. We may learn more about it. As we begin to investigate, the macro world and the micro world, and where those formula break down, and where our understanding breaks down, we would be learning more about it. But it's not like we're not likely to discover that angels actually hold your feet to the ground and push objects around in space, and we assign different numbers of angels based on the mass of the object. And that's why it looks like mass is relevant to gravity, but it's really not. I mean, it's absurd in the extreme to think that we would ever discover that we were that wrong. we have a sufficient basic understanding that we build from, that those kind of, world-turning or world-overturning discoveries are just not likely to happen.
Right. One of the things that I had, that I'm glad I just read it because it reminded me, part of what made me want to talk about this was a dialogue that I had in person with a theist who looked at a statement in the paper that had to do with the findings from the Mars rover. Mm-hmm. And there was something in the paper that talked about one of the findings and what it implicated. And then there was, very quickly after that, there was something else had gotten analyzed, and it turned that over. So it was like, well, we thought this, but then we got further analysis, and now we see that can't be. And he was very upset when he was talking to me, and he was just like, well, now they're saying it's completely different. Like, first it was this, and now they're saying it's the total opposite of that, like just within a couple days. And I said, yes, that's because science adjusts to fit evidence and data. So if you get new data that conflicts, and that shows you that it's not what you thought it was, you have to own up to that and say it's not what I thought it was. And one of the things I said to him was, when you tell me something, when you make a claim, when you say to me anything, doesn't that come with an understanding that it's based on everything you know?
Yeah.
And so what I wrote was, scientists speak with an asterisk beside every statement that footnotes this: based on the best and most current data available. This is no different than the same asterisk that any one of us would use in every statement of fact we would make to anyone in our lives. It is unreasonable to assume a statement from a researcher would come without such a caveat.
Yeah, and the underlying problem here is, when we say all the time, because I can't count the number of times somebody with a religious mindset, a religious worldview, has written in to say, well, science gets it wrong all the time. How can you rely on anything science says? It's constantly changing. Holy cow, they say one thing and then later on they learn something new and say another. So there's no good reason to rely on science at all. Oh, please. Have you ever been to a doctor? Do you eat food? Do you watch the TV show? Do you have glasses?
Computer.
Are you aware that we sent people to the moon?
iPhone.
Do you have a computer? I mean, all these amenities, that's science in action. There is good reason to rely on the findings of science. The problem here is not science, it's you. You're expecting firm, true, authoritative answers, because that's what religion offers. Religion is unchanging. It says God did it and that's all we ever need to know. It inhibits investigation. It can't change. Most of them are completely immune from change. And in fact, you're forced to ignore or rationalize away evidence that would conflict with a religious worldview. This need, this intense curiosity that we have, this uncomfortable feeling we have with not knowing, this desire to have answers, I understand it. It drives all of us. It's what drives scientists. Scientists are ever trying to approach that truth. But we've come to understand that because of our failings and our limited knowledge and the fact that we're fledglings at this, that all of our discoveries are tentative. There aren't absolute truths. But religion feeds you this idea and builds up a mindset where you're expecting to get answers, because that's what religion pretends to give you. When in fact, most religions, at least as far as I can tell, don't actually offer real answers at all. They offer non-answers. Where did the universe come from? Well, God created it. Well, you haven't told me a thing, because you cannot describe any mechanism for this. You cannot even possibly come to a description of God. In fact, you might say that God is beyond our ken completely, that we can't even understand it. So you haven't offered me an explanation. What you have offered me is a stopgap, a way of preventing me from asking future questions, a way of inhibiting investigation and progress. I mean, that's just the way religion ends up working.
Right, because it fosters a huge, huge level of discomfort with the honest answer, I don't know.
Yeah.
That is
tough.
so unacceptable to so many fundamentalists. It's unbelievable how uncomfortable they are with an I don't know answer. And they will give you an answer that is incorrect, and you say, you're trying to explain to them, we don't know. I don't know, and you don't know. And that answer that you're providing is not an answer. I don't
know is so uncomfortable that this answer feels good as preferable.
I would rather say fairies make the flowers bloom than admit I don't know why flowers bloom. And it's like, well, but if you're saying the fairies make the flowers bloom and they don't, then you still don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not knowledge. It's just a patch to make you feel better, like you actually do know something that you don't. But they prefer that, and it's like they almost attack the response, I don't know. You'll say, I don't know, and they will say, oh, see, you don't know.
Yeah.
It's like,
It
right,
could be.
I don't know.
I
And
might
why
be
is that a
right.
problem?
And on that note, we had a couple people holding